I was 19 years old the summer I worked at Meadow Pines. That's not its real name. I changed it, partly out of respect for the place and the people who live there, and partly because I'm honestly not sure how I'd feel about someone Googling it and connecting it to what I'm about to tell you. But it was a real place. A real nursing and long-term care facility in a mid-sized town in the Midwest, the kind of town where everybody's grandmother ended up in a place like that eventually. Single story, spread out, pale brick exterior with flower beds out front that the staff kept up because the residents who could still get outside liked to look at them. Clean, well run, the kind of place families felt okay leaving their people. I got the job through my aunt, who was a nurse there. I needed summer work and she put in a word, and they needed someone to cover a gap in the overnight aide rotation. I want to be clear about what my job actually was, because it matters for the story. I was not a nurse or any kind of medical professional. I was a 19-year-old with no particular qualifications who helped with non-medical overnight tasks. Checking on residents, helping with comfort needs, keeping the night log, alerting the on-call nurse if something came up. Companion work, essentially. Being present. Making sure nobody fell, nobody was distressed. Nobody was alone if they woke up at 3 in the morning and needed a glass of water and someone to sit with them for a minute. I worked 3 nights a week, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., May through August. And I want to tell you that most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Long, quiet nights. Dim hallways. The soft sounds of a building full of sleeping people. The occasional cough or movement behind a closed door. The hum of the HVAC system. The small noises that any institutional building makes when most of the humans in it are asleep. I got good at moving quietly. I got good at sitting still. I read a lot of books that summer. Paperbacks I prop on the nurse's station desk in the small hours when the whole place was settled, and I was supposed to stay awake and alert. But there was nothing to be alert about. The residents, the ones who were still fairly present mentally and could hold a conversation, tended to be awake at odd hours. That's a thing that happens with elderly people, especially in care facilities. Their sleep gets fragmented, they wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. and can't get back down, and they'd shuffle out to the common room or ring for someone to come sit with them. I spent a lot of hours that summer sitting in the dim common room with someone's grandmother or grandfather, drinking decaf from the little courtesy machine and listening to stories about people and places and times that were decades gone. I loved that part. Genuinely. Old people who've lived full lives and are in the mood to talk are some of the best company there is, if you're willing to slow down enough to receive it. And it was in those conversations, those quiet, middle-of-the-night conversations in the common room or at a bedside, that the warnings started. The first one came from a woman named Vera. She was 87, sharp as anything, had been a school teacher for 40 years, and retained the particular authority of someone who has managed classrooms of children for 4 decades. She said things once, and in a tone that expected to be listened to. She was from Eastern Europe originally, had come to this country as a young woman, and she had an accent that softened her vowels and made everything she said sound slightly more formal than the words themselves. I liked Vera enormously. About 2 weeks into my job, she woke up at around 2:30 and I went to check on her, and she was sitting up in bed with the light on, reading. Perfectly comfortable. She invited me to sit. We talked for a while about what I was studying in college, what I wanted to do with my life, the usual questions adults ask, 19-year-olds. And then, during a lull in the conversation, she looked at me very directly and said, "Has anyone told you about the East Hallway?" I said no. She nodded like she'd expected that. She said that the East Hallway, the wing that ran from the common room toward what used to be an older part of the building, had a different quality than the rest. She said that people who worked nights noticed it more than day staff, because at night it was more pronounced. She said, "Things happen in that hallway that don't have a good explanation. I've heard the staff talk about it when they don't think we're listening. And I've seen things from my doorway." Her room was not on the East Hallway, she was in the main wing, but she said that certain residents in the East Wing talked about things they experienced there. Sounds, presences, visitors who weren't family and weren't staff. I asked her what kind of visitors. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, The ones who come when someone is getting close to the end. Sitting with them, keeping them company until it's time. She paused. It's not a frightening thing, in my understanding. It seems to be a kindness. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, "That's an interesting thing to believe." And Vera gave me the look that I imagined she gave generations of students who said something slightly dim in her classroom. She said, "It's not a belief, dear. It's an observation. There's a difference." I thought about that a lot in the days that followed, and I started paying more attention to the east hallway on my rounds. The east hallway was physically different from the rest of the building in a few small ways. It was slightly older. You could tell by the floor, which was a slightly different tile, and by the width of the door frames, which were narrower. The lighting was the same overhead fluorescent as everywhere else, but somehow it always seemed dimmer out there, which I eventually decided was because the ceiling was a few inches lower and the light had less room to spread. It was cooler too, consistently, by a degree or two that you'd notice when you turned the corner from the main hallway into it. Nothing happened for the first few weeks. I'd walk the east hallway on my rounds, noted in the log, and walk back. Quiet, empty, slightly cool. Nothing unusual. Then one night in late June, I was doing my 2 a.m. round, and I turned into the east hallway and I stopped walking. There was a figure at the far end of the hall, standing near the window at the end, which looked out onto the side garden, which was just dark grass and shrubs at that hour. The figure was not one of the residents. It was the wrong shape, too upright, too still. Not a staff member either, because I knew all the overnight staff, and this wasn't any of them. It was there for maybe 3 seconds, and then it wasn't. Not like it walked through a door or turned a corner, just wasn't there anymore. I stood in the hallway for a solid minute before I kept walking. I finished my round. I wrote in the log, "East hallway, all clear, no incidents," which was the truth in all the ways that the log was designed to capture. Nothing had happened that required notation, but I sat at the nurse's station for a while afterward and thought about what Vera had said. The next time I worked, I stopped in to see her. She was awake and reading as usual, and she looked at me when I came in and said, "You saw something." It wasn't a question. I told her what I'd seen and she listened, and then she asked which room was nearest to where the figure had been standing. I told her. She nodded slowly. She said, "Mrs. Patterson is in that room. She hasn't been well." Mrs. Patterson, I knew, was 91 and had been declining steadily for the past month. I'd sat with her a few times when she was having a restless night, and she was a sweet woman, small and soft-voiced, who liked to hold someone's hand and listen to the radio. She was not in good shape. Mrs. Patterson passed away 4 days later, on a night I wasn't working. When I came in for my next shift, the day staff told me quietly as they were leaving. I stood in the hallway outside her room for a moment after I got the news. The door was open, the room already being readied for the next occupant, the particular emptiness of a room that recently held a person and doesn't anymore. I went and told Vera that evening, and she nodded and said, "She wasn't alone then, that's good." I said, "Is it always like that? Someone comes before?" Vera considered this. She said, "Not always in a visible way, not always in a way that gets noticed." But she said that in her experience, and in the experience of others she'd spoken with over the years, residents and staff both, there was often something, a sense of presence, a sound, sometimes an actual figure, and it was always in the days or hours before, never after, like something came to accompany rather than to collect, like someone showed up early to make sure the person knew they wouldn't have to make the journey alone. I've thought about that framing for years since. Showed up early to make sure they wouldn't be alone. I had 2 more experiences in the east hallway that summer. The first was a sound, a kind of low murmuring, like a conversation being held just below hearing, that I noticed one night around 4 a.m. It lasted maybe 30 seconds and then stopped. I checked all the rooms in the vicinity and everyone was asleep. The resident in the room nearest to where the sound seemed to come from was a man named Harold, who was 89 and had dementia, and who passed away 11 days later. The second experience was the most vivid, and it's the one that stays with me most clearly. It was a night in early August, hot summer night, and the facility's AC was working overtime. I was doing my 3 a.m. round in the east hallway, and I passed the room of a woman named Dorothy, mid-80s, former librarian, still very mentally present but physically frail. A woman I'd had many lovely conversations with over the summer about books and the town's history, and her late husband, who she spoke about with a kind of easy warmth that told you they'd been really good together. The door to Dorothy's room was slightly open, which wasn't unusual, and as I passed it I glanced in the way I always did, just checking. There were 2 people in the room. Dorothy was in her bed, awake, propped up on her pillows. And there was someone sitting in the chair beside her bed. Someone I didn't recognize, an older man sitting quietly, just present. He and Dorothy appeared to be talking. I could see the slight movement of her speaking, the attitude of his listening. I stopped. I looked again. The man in the chair turned slightly, and I caught his profile. And I know how this sounds. I know how every version of this kind of story sounds, but I am telling you what I saw. He was not a current staff member. He was not a family member I'd ever seen visit. He was an older man in clothes that seemed slightly out of period, not dramatically, not costumed dramatically, just slightly. The way someone's clothes look in a photograph from a few decades ago. He didn't look at me. Dorothy didn't look at me. I stood in the doorway for probably 10 seconds, which is a long time to stand in a doorway, and then I walked on. I finished my round and I sat with it. And then I went back to Dorothy's room about 20 minutes later. Knocked softly, eased the door open. Dorothy was alone, awake, her lamp on low. She looked at me with those clear eyes of hers and smiled and said, "Couldn't sleep either." I said I was just checking in. I said, "How are you feeling tonight?" She said she was feeling very good, actually. She said she'd had some company earlier, which had been nice. And then she picked up her book and began to read, and I said goodnight and left. Dorothy passed away a week after that. Peacefully, in her sleep, on a night I wasn't there. The day staff again told me when I came in. I went and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before my shift and thought about Dorothy and her late husband she'd spoken about with such easy warmth. And I thought about the man in the chair beside her bed and the way they'd been together, quiet and present, like 2 people who had been sitting together for years and knew exactly how to do it. The last person I talked to about the East Hallway that summer was a man named Gerald, who was 84 and had been at Meadow Pines for 3 years and had the specific authority of someone who'd been in a place long enough to understand its patterns. I told him a little about what I'd experienced, keeping it general, not wanting to upset him. He listened and then he chuckled, which surprised me. He said, "You're not the first one." He said every few years a new night person would notice the East Hallway and start asking around. He said the longtime staff knew about it and didn't talk about it much, not because it scared them, but because it was simply a feature of the place that had been there longer than any of them, and that didn't require a lot of commentary. He said, "It's not a bad thing, son, whatever it is. In 30 years of visiting people in places like this, I've never once heard of it being a bad thing." I asked him if he ever thought about it in terms of his own situation. He was quiet for a moment and then he smiled, a good smile, a real one, and said, "Sometimes. And it doesn't frighten me. The idea of someone showing up early, someone to sit with you, that doesn't frighten me at all." I finished out the summer at Meadow Pines and went back to college in the fall. I kept in touch with my aunt who worked there for a while, but eventually we both got busy and the contact drifted, and now I don't have a connection to that place anymore. But I think about it. I think about those long, quiet nights and the low hum of the building and the east hallway with its slightly lower ceiling and its 2 degrees of extra cool. I think about Vera and her schoolteacher's precision, the difference between belief and observation. I think about Dorothy and the man in the chair and the easy companionable quiet of 2 people who know each other well. I'm 33 now. My grandmother is in her 90s and is in a facility somewhat like Meadow Pines, and when I visit her I find myself noticing the hallways, the quality of the light, the temperature, the way certain corridors feel different from others in ways that are hard to name. I don't know what I believe about what happens after. I've never been someone with strong convictions either way. But I know what I saw in that east hallway over a summer when I was 19 years old. And I know what Vera said with the precision of a woman who had lived 87 careful and observant years. It's not a belief, dear. It's an observation. There's a difference. Whatever comes before the end to sit with people, whatever showed up in that east hallway, whatever sat in the chair beside Dorothy's bed, it wasn't frightening. It was patient. It was gentle. It was there early, making sure no one would have to go alone. I find that more comforting than I know how to say. Good night, Dorothy. Good night, Gerald. Good night, Vera. I hope someone came early for each of you.